الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. So as we continue discussing the book Talkhis Nukhbatul Fikr by one of the ulama of Mu'asir, or one of the Mashaykh of Mu'asir, and this book is a Muqtasar, as it is named. It's a Talkhis of the book Nukhbatul Fikr. So as we know that Nukhbatul Fikr is a book authored by Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah ta'ala, one of the ulama of Hadith, and this book is considered to be an important book in the study of Ilm al-Hadith. So with this book, we have been covering this book, and we have reached the point where the author have mentioned regarding concerning Hadith al-Mardud. So Hadith al-Mardud, Hadith that are said to be rejected, Hadith that are said to be weak, and then he started to outline what are some of the causes for Hadith to be weak. So he mentioned that of the reason why a Hadith will be graded as weak, that either saqt fil isnad, that either, or of those as saqt fil isnad, that one of the narrator is missing, that should be in the isnad, or he mentions of those reasons that he mentioned tan fil rawi, or also a tan that one of the narrator is criticized. So the matter that he have raised, that we are discussing of those reasons. So of the reason regarding matter that relates to the isnad, so either saqt fil isnad or tan fil rawi, of the reason behind hadith could be considered to be daif. So today inshallah ta'ala, in this session, that in continuing discussing of those reasons why there is a saqt fil isnad, that there's someone that is missing, a narrator that is missing in the isnad, or narrators that are missing isnad. We had covered in previous session mu'allaq, and explain what is mu'allaq, and the masail, the matter that relates to mu'allaq, hadith al-mu'allaq. Then we discussed second where there's mursal, so both are from both ends, where al-mu'allaq by way of a saqt, a narrator that is not mentioned, a disconnection by way of the author of the book. So the author who's putting the book together, that he have dropped or not mentioned certain of narrators from his side, then that's mu'allaq, and that could have many narrators that are missed. Then also by way of the hadith that he mentioned next is al-mursal. So hadith al-mursal, where you find that there's a breakage in isnad, but by way from the other end of the hadith, with by way of the Sahaba. So from the direction of the Sahaba, that al-mursal, where the narrator that was a tabi'i, that he narrates direct upon the Prophet ﷺ. So between him and the Prophet ﷺ, there are narrators. There are other narrators between himself and the Prophet ﷺ. So there's someone or individuals that are missing in the isnad. So today inshallah ta'ala, we'll be discussing what he mentioned next, that in this talqis he mentioned regarding after al-mursal, that he discussed what saqt isna al-isnad. That also, again, from the next spectrum, that saqt, that someone is missing or not mentioned by way of the isna as isnad, which is inside the center of the isnad. So either someone missing from the beginning of the isnad, or from the end of the isnad, or from the center, the middle of the isnad. So this is what to be covered. So he mentioned as-saqt isna as-sanad, an yakun al-hadith isna as-sanad isnad ay laysa min awwali wala min akhiri. So this is a breakage that have occurred not at the beginning of the isnad, nor at the end of the isnad. It is within the center of the isnad, so from two ends. Then I mentioned فإن السقط من الإسناد راويان أو أكثر على توالي يسمى معدل. So he mentioned that فإن السقط, that if the breakage, the one who's missing, or those that are missing in the isnad, rawiyan, two, or akthar, or more, multiple, ala tawali, and they have consistency, then it mentioned yusamma mu'dal. Then this is referred to as mu'dal according to the ulama of hadith. And we'll discuss of this point. Then I mentioned وإن كان السقط بالإثنين فأكثر ولكن غير متتابع فيسمى منقطع. Then also if there's others are missing two or more, or we'll mention then two or more, and it is not per se that they are not one after another, then considered to be Munqati. So the author, rahimahullah ta'ala, wished to discuss two matters. Hadith that are said to be Hadith Mu'dal, and the second Hadith Munqati. So inshallah ta'ala, that will be our discussion regarding this particular matter. Then he mentioned regarding concerning evidence regarding مثال التوضيح. يقال إمام أبي داود رحمه الله تعالى في سننه حدثنا مسدد قال حدثنا سفيان عن زهري عن محمد بن جبير ابن مطعم عن أبيه يبلغه به نبي عليه السلام قال لا يدخل الجنة قاطع الرحم. Then he mentioned إذا حدثنا مسدد, and he mentioned if مسدد, the first narrator, is missing, then that's called mu'allaq. And then he went through, and we'll just come back to that point inshallah ta'ala. So as for this discussion today, bi'awnillahi subhanahu wa ta'ala, in this session we'll try to discuss those 2 points, or those 2 terminologies and matters relating to ilm al-hadith, ilm usul al-hadith, which is matter relating to hadith, what we refer to as hadith al-mu'dal, and second hadith al-munqati. On this point, that of those who have written this point, just as a clarity regarding concerning this matter, that of those who have kind of somewhat have mentioned regarding on these points, regarding of these terminologies, that you might find that some of these terminology that become more predominant and more established in the ulama mutaakhirin compared to the ulama of awahil, the earlier scholars, the original scholars of hadith, or the early scholars of hadith, that they per se may use these more general, that these terminologies sometimes are used more general, not as specific as used by the ulama of the latter time. So we are so Ibn Hajar rahimahullah ta'ala, of those of the ulama who try to kind of somewhat to specify, be more specific regarding some of these terminologies, which the ulama before were less were not may use these words more general compared to what it is used from the time of Ibn Hajar, and now what is the established practice. So regarding al-mu'dal will be the first of those to be covered. So they mentioned regarding al-mu'dal, regarding concerning that they mentioned that mu'dal linguistically, hadith al-mu'dal linguistically, we're considering mustaghliq al-shadid. So something which is sab shadid, so something which is said to be something which is that very intense, then that is mu'dal. So mu'dal, something is very intense, then this is said to be mu'dal. So mu'dal regarding concerning isnad, very intense. And as some have clarified regarding that mu'dal, that so the word using and mu'dal, that's something which is very intense. That they mentioned that these particular, as some have mentioned, so these are of those 2 categories, mu'dal, which is the third, and munqati, the fourth of those terminologies in ilm al-hadith to be covered regarding indicating that a breakage have occurred in the isnad. So al-mu'dal, as we mentioned linguistically, it means mustaghlaq al-shadid, something which is very intense. So they mentioned that al-amru shadid alladhi la yaqum lahu sahibu, there's something which is very intense that a person is unable to bear. So al-mu'dal, something which is very intense, that becomes very difficult for the person to bear. That the ulama of hadith, concerned in the ulama of hadith of past, that they use the word as some of indicate that al-mu'dal of the ulama of past, that they are more used to indicate that hadith is shadid daf, da'ifun shadid, that hadith is very weak. So at times this word may be used not in the manner as it is used today by the ulama of old, but indicating when it is used that it indicates that the hadith is da'if shadid, that the hadith is very weak. But overall, that next regarding al-mu'dal, as mentioned, istilahan in the ulama al-hadith. So the word mu'dal, as referred to hadith al-mu'dal, what is meant by this according to the ulama of hadith? They are mentioned of the definition that is given, that and the one that is mentioned by Ibn Hajar alayhi rahmatullahi ta'ala, قال هو ما سقط من إسناد, or what is mentioned ما سقط من إسناد اثنين فساهد على توالي. So after the definition gives that ما سقط من إسناد, ما سقط في إثناء الإسناد راويان فأكثر على توالي. So with a different wording, but this is the general meaning of what is mentioned regarding Hadith al-Mu'dal. So of those definitions that are given by Ibn Hajar, ما سقط من إسناد اثنين فساهد على توالي. So of the ulama mentioned regarding that model, that of the definition that is given, that what of those that are narrators that are missing, not mentioned from the isnad, two or more ala tawali, ala consistency. So one after the other. So when you find that two or more, one behind the other, that they are missing, then that is said to be Hadith al-Mu'dal. So it requires two narrators, but also those two must be one behind the other or more, but you have consistency regarding that all these one or two are missing, then that is said to be Hadith al-Mu'dal. So that the definition is given by some of the ulama. Of the ulama mentioned regarding concerning that al-Mu'dal, that they mentioned that fi isna al-isnad. They mentioned that it occurs in the center of the isnad. So of those who mentioned that Hadith al-Mu'dal, and that's what the practice of more so of today, and the understanding of today regarding Hadith al-Mu'dal, that you'll find that there's two or more narrators that are missing. Second, that it occur that these narrators, that they are one after another, so some consistency in those narrators. So multiple narrators are missing, one behind another. So there's a chain of them that are missing, one behind another. And the third point that they mentioned, that is tawali. And the third that they mentioned, fi isna al-isnad. So isnad regarding that is not from the start of the isnad, nor from the end of isnad, but it is within the middle, the center of the isnad. That is what is the general understanding of what is said to be, or definition given regarding Hadith al-Mu'dal. So Hadith al-Mu'dal, that's the general understanding that is put forward regarding Hadith al-Mu'dal. So of the ulama who mentioned regarding concern of those who may not mention fi ithna as isnad. So I mentioned ma sakata min isnadi rawiyan فأكثر على توالي. So that's the definition that is stated, I've mentioned regarding Hadith al-Mu'dal. So Hadith al-Mu'dal, then Ibn Hajar, and of those who of Ibn Salah and others, that, and especially in particular Ibn Hajar in his book Nukhbatul Fikr, that they try to make a clear distinction regarding all these type of definition. And also in the case of discussing regarding Saqt fil Isnad, that where breakage occur in isnad, that he tries to somewhat pinpoint that any type of breakage, it have a different terminology that is used. So every breakage or every saqt that occurs in the isnad, that he use a specific word for each. So that's concerning the thing that Ibn Hajar that he tries to concentrate upon. So that's concerning the definition of Hadith al-Mu'dal as mentioned here. Then they mention regarding concerns al-amthila. So example regarding Hadith al-Mu'dal. So Hadith you have other definition, but though that's the predominant definition that is used today regarding Hadith al-Mu'dal. So they mentioned that example regarding Hadith al-Mu'dal, that as mentioned by al-Hakim, hadith that is mentioned, قال الحاكم قال حدثنا أبو عباس محمد بن يعقوب قال أنبأنا محمد بن عبد الله بن عبد الحكم قال حدثنا ابن واب قال أخبرني مخرمة ابن بكير عن أبيه عن عمر بن شعيب قال عبد الله قال قاتل أبدا مع رسول الله عليه السلام يوم الأحد فقال له رسول الله عليه السلام أذن لك سيدك. So it mentioned regarding that, so the hadith, it mentioned that with the isnad, and the focus will be on the isnad. But as for the matter of the hadith, it generally mentioned that you find that a servant that he fought alongside with the Prophet ﷺ Yawm al-Uhud. فقال, so the Prophet ﷺ, he said to this person, were you given a permission by your master? قال لا. Then he says no. فقال لو قتلت دخلت النار. That if you were to be killed, then you have entered النار. Al-Hadith. So he mentioned here regarding concerning this particular hadith, that is shared from the hadith that they mentioned regarding concerning that so they mentioned regarding concerning this hadith is considered to be a model. So they mentioned فقد عادل هذا حديث هذا إسناد. They mentioned that the reason concerning is Amr ibn Shuhaib, that he as the one that he have narrated, where he has skipped and narrate directly upon the Prophet Islam. So between Amr ibn Shuhaib, that there's others after him, but he did not mention them. So there's multiple narrators that he did not mention. So Amr ibn Shu'aib did not mention those narrators that came after him. So you find that of the ulama who mentioned regarding that hadith al-modal, as they mentioned regarding that, they have mentioned that of the surah, that an yarfa tabi'in al-hadith and Nabi al-Islam, where a tabi'in, one of the followers of the tabi'in, that they narrate a hadith upon the Prophet al-Islam. That's of one of the definition, or what is sometimes mentioned as hadith al-modal. So between that tabi'in, so we have the Prophet al-Islam, then we have the Sahaba, then we have the Tabi'in, then we have the Atba at-Tabi'in. So before Atba at-Tabi'in, Tabi'in, we'll have the Tabi'in, and then we have the Sahaba. So between this, so for a Tabi'in to narrate hadith, then will be different there will be several generations between him and the Prophet al-Islam. So that hadith is said to be model. According to some of the ulama, they consider the hadith to be of the example of hadith al-model, as they see that hadith al-model also at times it will be a hadith where a tabi'i that he narrate upon the Prophet ﷺ. So this case will be of that hadith where Amr ibn Shu'aib of a tabi'in narrating upon the Prophet ﷺ. So those concerning that hadith that is said to be model. Another example they give concerning Rawahu Malik rahimahullah ta'ala in his book Al-Muwatta. قال أنه قال بلغني عن أبي هريرة رضي الله عنه أن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قال للمملوك طعامه وقسوته. That the Prophet ﷺ mentioned regarding that, for the mamluk, for the slave, that is ta'am wa kiswa. So it to be provided food and also clothing. Then I mentioned that Al-Malik rahimahullah ta'ala, that this hadith was somewhat, it was given a full, the full chain was mentioned outside the book of Muwatta. When I mentioned that Imam Malik rahimahullah that he narrate an Muhammad ibn Ajlan, an Abihi, an Abi Hurairah. So the full isnad, so Imam Malik in Muwatta, he narrated that Balagani an Abi Hurairah, and he mentioned the hadith. So between Imam Malik and Abi Hurairah, there are many tabaqat, layers of narrators. And they mention that this hadith, when the isnad is found, that to show the hadith is a model, that between Imam Malik and Abi Hurairah, we have one, Muhammad ibn Ajlan, and also Ajlan. So between Malik and Abu Hurairah, we have two narrators that were not mentioned, but they were found out to be these two, Muhammad ibn Ajlan and also Ajlan. So the hadith is said to be mu'dal in the narration of Al-Muwatta, because the two narrators are missing in the isnad, and they are fall in the somewhat center of within the middle of the isnad. The next of those matters regarding hadith al-modal, al-yataj bil-modal, is hadith al-modal said to be a proof or not? Is it said to be hadith which is said to be authentic or not? So hadith al-modal is hadith that said to be hukum hadith al-modal. Hadith al-modal la yahtaj bi. ومن أقسام hadith al-daif. So hadith al-modal is not a proof. And second, is considered to be, so hadith al-modal is classed as hadith which is said to be of hadith al-daif. So it is considered to be of those hadith that are classified as hadith al-daif. And the reason, jahalat as-saqitin. So the reason is not knowing those that are missing, those that are not mentioned. So hadith al-modal, and also you find that there's multiple, two or more narrators that are missing. So not knowing the affairs and the state of those narrators, who they are, then that's the reason behind the hadith being da'if. So as we had mentioned before, that the criteria of deciding hadith, whether it is authentic or not, that we have certain criteria in place. So of those criteria, we have ittisal sanad, so hadith al-modal, that because there's people that are missing, so this first condition, it is forfeited. Ittisal sanad is not a continuous chain. And also second, we mentioned of the criteria, adalatul ar-rawat, that the narrators also, that their people are said to be of adala. And also because we don't know who they are, we don't need their adala. Because we do not know who they are, these narrators, because they're not mentioned, they're not there, they're absent. So based upon this, we do not know their state of affairs regarding their adala and also their dabt. So these are those three factors are missing in this hadith. They're not in line where Adam al-Ittisal is not continuous, connected from start to end. And also because there's it is not connected, then also the isnad, then the narrators, we do not know their affairs. We do not know their affairs. So it lose that ittisal as-sanad. And also by this, as mentioned, and the ulama mentioned regarding that it's not considered to be hadith which is said to be authentic, not of those hadith said to be authentic. As we said, the hadith is said to be da'if. They have mentioned regarding concerning Ayyuwa, which is the ulama discussed concerning that. As for the status of hadith al-modal, amongst hadith that are said to be da'if, due to there's a sakt in the isnad, they mention regarding concerning the Jur Zajani, so Jur Zajani, he mentioned regarding al-modal, he mentioned al-modal aswa halan min al-munqati, that he said that modal, hadith al-modal is a worse state than that of a hadith al-munqati, because modal is multiple individuals are missing in general, and in sense that is worse than a munqati, but also that requires some type of explanation regarding that munqati also could be as even, could equally as bad as that of a modal. So if it's a munqati, we have multiple narrators that are missing, then it equates that of a modal. And inqita, munqati also could at times could have one person missing, and at times could have multiple narrators that are missing. So if there's multiple narrators that are missing in the hadith said to be munqati, then it becomes like that of modal. Is as bad as modal. So modal, it is bad because there's multiple, two or more narrators that are said to be missing. Then he mentioned wa munqati aswahal min al-mursal. Then he went on to mention that munqati is worse than that of a mursal. Then he mentioned wal mursal la takun bihi al-hujja. La takun bihi hujja. So that's concerning how the ulama look at munqati. He said to be of those that can be at times that the weakness is intense. They mention regarding that the word model in the language of the ulama mutaqaddimin. So al-model is usage among the ulama of the past, the early scholars of hadith, al-mutaqaddimin as they refer to as, or a'immatil al-wa'il. So the ulama of past, the early scholars of hadith, so the early scholars of hadith that set the foundation of ilm al-hadith, that what's their take in usage of this particular term. At times, to be mindful that the terminologies and understanding of an application of the ulama of awa'il, al-mutaqaddimin, and that of the ones of, they say, mutaakhirin, the ones that came after, latter day scholars, sometimes I find a slight difference in the use of terminologies and also some of the application of the qawaid al-ilm al-hadith. So I want to be mindful of this. As for the ulama al-mutaqaddimin who set the bars, set the rules regarding are set the fundamental rules regarding ilm al-hadith, that regarding concerning al-model, that at times may use model not indicating the hadith of a sect. So model in the mutaakhirin, that we understand that it means that there's a sect, that there's a disconnection in the isnad. When you use model, a word model is used amongst the ulama, mutaakhirin. That is to understand that what is meant, that there's a disconnection, a breakage in the isnad of two or more narrators, and each behind and they're together. So a chunk together of narrators are missing. But is that the case with some of the usage of the ulama of past? So to understand how the ulama of past, the early scholars, use the term model and their application. Ibn Hajar عليه رحمة الله تعالى قال وجدت تعبير بالمعدل يعني عند في كلام جماعة يعني he mentioned that he have found that a group of the ulama of past have used the word model, have used this terminology من أئمة الحديث, from the ulama of hadith, فيما لم يسقط منه شيء البتة, where he mentioned it, where there's no breakage in isnad. So the word model is used by some of the ulama of past when it does not indicate that there's any breakage in isnad. So what do they intend by this? So there's no disconnection in the isnad, there's no sakt in the isnad. What they intend by this, that they mentioned regarding concerning that of the ulama, that dhuhali, and a time I've used the word model, and I've mentioned regarding concern that they mentioned hadith قال حدثنا أبو صالح حراني قال حدثنا ابن لهيعة أن يزيد ابن أبي حبيب أن ابن شهاب أن عروة أن عائشة رضي الله عنها قالت كان رسول الله عليه السلام يعتكف ويمر بالمريض فيسلم عليه ولا يقف. That the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that the hadith here that is mentioned, that it states with the isnad as an example, and Abu Saleh who narrates upon Ibn La'iyah, Abdullah ibn La'iyah, and Yazid ibn Abi Habib, and Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, and Urwa, and Aisha radhiyallahu anha, that mentioned the Prophet ﷺ that he will go by in performing ittikaf, that he will go by a person that is ill and give him salam, but he would not stop. He will not wait around. He will not wait around. Then I mentioned that قال الزهري قال ساري الذهلي قال الذهلي, one of the mashayikh of hadith and also one of the teachers of Imam Bukhari. So Dhuhli, Muhammad ibn Yahya al-Dhuhli, who said to be was one of the teachers of Imam Bukhari عليهم رحمة الله تعالى, قال هذا حديث model. He said this hadith is model. Why? ولا وجه له, but also it has no place. إنما هو فعل عائشة رضي عنها ليس النبي عليه السلام. But he mentioned that this is a statement or the action of Aisha, not the Prophet عليه السلام. Then I mentioned وهم فيما نرى من ابن لهيعة, and the one who made from what I see is that the one who made an error is an error by Ibn La'iyah, that elevate the hadith or narrate the hadith upon the Prophet of Islam, but actually something that goes back to Aisha. But the isnad is intact. So at times the ulama regarding concerns that the word model is to indicate that there's a weakness in the hadith, a weakness in the hadith. So at times ulama mentioned regarding al-model also mean considered shadid al-daf. So also in some hadith that they'll mention the hadith shadid al-daf. So the ulama views the word model, but not in the manner that became established today. As for like Madan hadith al-model, so hadith al-model, by way of source, we can find hadith model of what I mentioned about ulama of hadith. They mentioned that of the source that you find hadith model, we find multiple narrators that are missing in the isnad from the within the center of the isnad or the likes. They mentioned that as-sunan, and they mentioned concerning lil Sa'id ibn Mansur al-Khurasani. So Uthman or Abi Uthman Sa'id ibn Mansur al-Khurasani who died 207 al-Hijri, after the Hijrah. He has a book called As-Sunan. So that book, you mentioned a hadith, and part of that book is in print. Part of that book is in print. So he mentioned in that book matters pertaining to that you find is asanid, isnad, that are model. Also, a second word they mention, the musannifat of Ibn Abi Dunya. So Ibn Abi Dunya was Abu Bakr, Abdullah ibn Muhammad al-Baghdadi, who died 281, that he has many works. So you have many works, that books, Az-Zuhd, Wal-Ahwal, Wal-Tawbah. So you have that of the recent that they have made a collection, a majmua, a collection of all of his works, that they try to compile many of his work into a majmua that goes into over 10 volumes plus, that these are the works of Ibn Abi Dunya. So you find that in most of those, in some of his works, of his books, you'll find Hadith al-Model, or Asani that are said to be model. So that's concerning Hadith al-Model. So Hadith al-Model, also bear in mind that it can also come in the form of, we say that some of the ulama take concern Hadith al-Model, that as mentioned, that some of the definition that they mention, ما سقط من إسناده اثنين فسائد على توالي, that of the definition that is given of Hadith al-Model, that if you find that there's two or more narrators that are missing, not mentioned, absent from the isnad, and they're one after another, then that is Hadith al-Model. At times that may also, that Hadith al-Model, that also may be similar to that of Hadith, which is called Mu'allaq. So Mu'allaq, even though by way of the person who said so, that Hadith, that definition, doesn't make a distinction regarding the start of the isnad, the center of the isnad, and the end of the isnad. So at times, Hadith al-Model might coincide with what is said to be Hadith al-Mu'allaq, and also Hadith al-Mursal. So model at times may coincide with Hadith al-Mu'allaq by way of two or more are missing from the beginning of the isnad. So Hadith can be said to be Mu'allaq and also model. And also at the end of the Hadith, by way of the Sahaba, if you find that the Hadith is Mursal, we'll find that two or more narrators are missing in the isnad. So it will coincide with Hadith al-Mursal from that side. So of the ulama try to make a distinction between those two by saying that model, it applies to when the breakage occur in the center. But in some definition, it will coincide with al-Mu'allaq and also Hadith al-Mursal. Hopefully that was not confusing, but that to take into account. So the next of the point that they will discuss is the time factor, is Hadith al-Munqati. So Hadith al-Munqati, that of those that are mentioned within Hadith. So Hadith al-Munqati. So Ibn Hajar, that he mentioned Hadith al-Model, then he went to discuss Hadith al-Munqati. But you find that in many books of Hadith, that how things are organized, that they will mention Hadith Munqati, then they discuss Hadith al-Model. But Ibn Hajar, that he discussed Hadith al-Model, mentioned Hadith al-Model first, then he discussed Hadith al-Munqati after. But in books of Ibn Salah, and those who have worked around the books of Ibn Salah, that will mention Hadith al-Munqati, then they discuss Hadith al-Model after. So in starting discussion regarding Hadith al-Munqati, that they have stated regarding it, or regarding Hadith al-Munqati, that there's a discussion regarding the actual definition. So you have many aqwal that is mentioned regarding what is said to be Hadith al-Munqati, that you have several definitions that are mentioned regarding Hadith Munqati. So Munqati, by way of linguistically mean Adam al-Ittisal. Munqati mean Adam al-Ittisal. So meaning the Hadith that there's that it is not something which is mutasil, not something which is continuous. So there's a breakage. So linguistically Adam al-Ittisal, that it is something that there's a breakage that have occur, and it is not something which is consistent. or continuous flow. That is linguistically. So as for the meaning, according to the ulama of hadith, that you find several definitions that are put forward regarding hadith al-Munqati. So we mentioned of those definitions, the more renowned of those definitions that ulama mentioned, that one, they mentioned concerning هو الحديث الذي لم يتصل إسناده على أي وجه كان انقطاعه. That they mentioned the hadith al-Munqati, that some have mentioned that hadith, that it is not continuous, it has a breakage, and that breakage may occur at any point in the isnad. So any breakage that occur in the isnad, whether from the front, from the start, the center, or the end, that any form of breakage that occur in the isnad is munqati. And I mentioned, so that's concerning of the definitions that are given regarding hadith al-Munqati. And they do not make a distinction regarding mutawali or not. So if there's more than one, so that's concerning hadith munqati with some of the ulama. That's the definition that is mentioned by Khatib al-Baghdadi, also Ibn Abdul Barr, and also Ibn Salah. And you find that, so that's the definition of hadith al-Munqati, that is stated, huwa hadith الذي لم يتصل إسناده على أي وجه كان انقطاعه. That hadith, that a breakage have occurred at some point in the isnad, at any point. So a breakage in isnad at any point in the isnad, without distinguishing from the beginning, the center, or the end. As long as there is a breakage, then it is munqati. With other ulama, that definition will kind of somewhat coincide somewhat with hadith al-mursal, mu'allaq, i'dal, and the likes. So that hadith, that definition will fit any breakage in the isnad. So, and that shows again some ulama, they see in, so that's concerning of the definition that is given of those who give that definition. Khatib al-Baghdadi in his book al-Kifaya, also Ibn Abdul Barr in his book At-Tamheed, and also Ibn Salah in his book Al-Muqaddimah, Ibn Salah. And also of those who somewhat came after, or made a talkhis, or somewhat summarized the book of Muqaddimah Ibn Salah, like An-Nawawi and the likes, kind of somewhat also follow that definition, As-San'ani, they mentioned that As-San'ani, that As-San'ani قال ينبغي أن يرسم المنقطع بأنه ما سقط من رواته راو أو أكثر. So As-San'ani in his book, As-San'ani's book توضيح الأفكار لمعاني تنقيح الأنظار, a book also in Mustalah by As-San'ani, that also come in several volumes, that he mentioned regarding that, his input regarding hadith al-Munqati, that he mentioned that ينبغي أن يرسم, that as for the definition that is befitting للمنقطع, for hadith al-Munqati, بأنه ما سقط, which is that ما سقط من رواتي, that what have been missing or deleted from his narrators, راوٍ, one narrator, أو أكثر, or more, سواء كان على وجه توالي أو لا, whether it is done multiple narrators, whether they are one behind of consistent simultaneous, or they are separated. So they are simultaneous, one behind the other, or they're separated, then it is the same. So that definition we can somewhat overlap with other definition of modal, mursal, mu'allaq. That's the thing with that definition. So that definition more general, more broader, regarding what is al-anqita. So that's concerning that definition. Then I mention the next definition that is mentioned, which is after more, and this is the second popular definition, هو hadith al-Munqati هو الحديث الذي سقط من إسناده راو واحد. So al-munqati is when it's a hadith where one narrator is missing or multiple دون تتابع أو توالي, and they are not per se of that they are not one after another. They are not consistent. So there's a breakage between one and then another later on. So that's concerning hadith al-munqati, and that's the one that is now the one that is somewhat applied by most. That hadith al-munqati, that either you have one narrator, as some mentioned that hadith alladhi isqatuhu fi ithna isnad. So of those who mentioned hadith al-munqati, that's what is now, what the established now definition. Hadith al-munqati ma sakata min ithna al-isnad. That munqati, when a narrate, where it's a breakage of occurred in the center of the isnad, rawin wahid, one narrator, أو أكثر على غير توالي. So either one narrator in the middle, or if it is multiple narrator, they are not per se they're not successive, continuous, one after another. There's a breakage between. So if we were to look, for example, number 1, number 2 is missing. So number 1 is present, number 2 is missing, number 3 is present, number 4 is missing, number 5 is present. So there's 2, number 2 is missing, and number 4. So that would be on غير tawali. They are not one after another. That would be like a general idea of what is meant by way of that system. So you have other definitions given regarding hadith al-munqati, but that is the one that is mentioned here. That is of the more predominant definition given by hadith al-munqati. So with hadith al-munqati, as we had mentioned before, that of the ulama, that they sometimes use the word munqati simultaneous with other terminologies. Munqati sometimes is used with al-mursal. So sometimes, as we had mentioned before in hadith al-mursal, that's sometimes a word the ulama, when they use hadith al-mursal, that also they may use that word simultaneous with a word meaning munqati, as defined. I would say that Ibn Hajar and those who came after try to give each terminology its own distinctive definition. But with the ulama of past, some of those definitions might overlap. They may overlap. So al-munqati may overlap, as we mentioned the first definition, with other forms, any form of breakage in the isnad. So the word munqati sometimes is used more loose and more broader regarding any form of breakage in the isnad, while others try to give it its own distinctive definition, amongst those Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. I've also mentioned also regarding al-hadith al-munqati, that they'll mention regarding that also they are classed as munqati hadith where there's ibham. So ibham in the isnad. So the person is mentioned but ar-rajul. So they mention the isnad. So in the isnad you will mention regarding that the narrator says in another, قال حدثني الرجل and fulan, but didn't mention a person by name. So I said I will call ibham, mubham, rajulun mubham, by saying this person, rajul from Mecca, or imra, or الرجل قال بعض الناس من مكة. So that will call mubham. So is that also considered to be munqati? Of those who mention yes, that they see this as yes. So they see it as the person, you mention ar-rajul, because he's not identified by way of a name. They consider to be, that is considered to be mubham, but they also consider to be like a sakt in the isnad, as if he's present is as if he's absent. So you mention a person, a man, but that man will be considered to be as if he's absent. So of those who mention, it's still considered to be muttasil. Of those who mention that, it's not per se a sakt, but it's considered to be still muttasil because it mentioned an rajul. But we do not know who exactly that person. But he mentioned that to indicate that there's still a continuousness of the isnad. Al-munqati will be considered to be of a hadith, aqsam hadith daif. So it will be considered to be min aqsam hadith ad-daif. It's considered to be min aqsam hadith ad-daif. And as mentioned by Al-Bayhaqi عليه رحمة الله تعالى قال والحديث المنقطع لا حجة فيه. The hadith al-munqati لا حجة فيه. The reason is because there's a breakage. That the hadith that Adam al-ittisal. So of the condition of hadith as-sahih, that's the measuring stick, the criteria that each hadith must fulfill, that if Adam al-ittisal, that the hadith doesn't have a continuous chain from start to end, then if there's any form of breakage, then that will upset the hadith authenticity. That will go against the hadith authenticity. So al-inqita, where there's a person that is missing, then that will mean the hadith is forfeit the condition of al-ittisal, of being having a connected chain. And also الشوكاني قال لا تقوم الحجة بالحديث المنقطع. That Shawkani, who died 1250 al-Hijri, قال لا تقوم الحجة بالحديث المنقطع. That hadith al-munqati is not a proof. It is not a proof. Then he mentioned وهو الذي سقط من رواته واحد مما دون الصحابة. Where he mentioned that al-munqati, that where a person is missing other than the Sahaba. So someone is missing beyond, but other than the Sahaba. So overall, regarding hadith al-munqati, is considered to be hadith da'if due to Adam al-ittisal. Then I mentioned in the framework of hadith al-da'if is considered to be a severe weakness, or hadith which is said to be a more slight weakness. They mentioned hadith al-munqati, if it's only one person, as hadith al-munqati may have one or multiple person. If it is one person, they mentioned that it is of a more daf khafif. But if it is more, then it becomes daf shadid. So with that, inshallah ta'ala, we'll end this discussion regarding hadith al-munqati, and we'll end the discussion whatever remain of hadith al-munqati in the next session. So today, inshallah ta'ala, in this session, we cover most of what is said to be hadith al-modal, and also the discussion regarding hadith al-munqati. Just a few more things may remain regarding hadith al-munqati, and we'll discuss that in the next session, and then discuss the next topic after. With this, inshallah ta'ala, billahi ta'ala tawfiq wa hadi al-sabil. Hey, that clock is a bit slow.